a podcast about amazing people from an incredible state. Amazing Arizonans with Mike Broomhead.
Another episode of Amazing Arizonans, and a story I've been wanting to hear for quite a long time. Former United States Senator Jon Kyl. Thanks for doing this,
Mike,
Senator.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
My first days in radio were when you were in the Senate along with John McCain, and some of the most interesting conversations I've ever had have been with you about what seems to be the most boring topic on the planet, but water. Yeah. How did you, I want to start there. I want to get into your career and how it all began, but let's start with, you are known for protecting the water rights of Arizona and the southwestern United States. How did you become the expert?
Well, thanks for that. I'm not sure I'm an expert, but I, over time, have hired very smart people, which is one of the ways that you become successful. When I was a lawyer, one of our law firm's clients was the Salt River Project. And if you wanted to do any work for the Salt River Project, obviously you had to learn something about water, and I did. Over time, that led to involvement in some major Arizona legislation and litigation. As a result, I learned a lot about our water law. A lot of people in Arizona who know something about water because so many people have to work on it. I mean, look at the zanjeros out in the field that have to get the irrigation water from the main ditch into the rows to grow the cotton or the corn or whatever. But there is a little fraternity of water lawyers. Obviously, it's not for lawyers, it's not a big money maker, but people need to know something about water law, and I became knowledgeable about that and was able, therefore, to be involved in some of the major decisions that Arizonans had to make about water.
And when you look at where we are now, there are a lot of people that know this industry and know about water that credit you and your work for getting us to where we are. What needs to happen? What is going to happen to protect us and to give us what we need for the next generations?
Very good question, and it's on a lot of people's mind today because the droughts that we've had and the extra demand on water beyond what we had planned to develop have caused some shortages in different areas and some concerns about whether we're going to have enough water for the future. Now, representing the Chamber of Commerce people of Arizona, I would say to the people in New York, stay away. You're not going to get our water. We've got plenty to take care of ourselves. We will always be a prosperous part of the country. But obviously we're going to have to plan for growth. And that's where the concerns come in, because while we can take care of ourselves today, if a lot of people keep moving here and we continue to have demands for water, for example, chip making, which is a very good thing for growth in the state, and we've got some companies coming here that make chips, which are part of all of our electronics today. It takes a lot of water. It's just one of many industries that require water. And therefore, people say, well, are we going to have enough with all of these new demands coming along, in addition to the shortages that we've seen on the Colorado River? So less water, more demand, a little bit of concern about the future. Fortunately, we've got good people that work on it, that care about it, and I am confident that we will stay ahead of the curve as we have in the past. We've had it's generally a nonpartisan issue, so politics doesn't come into play that much, and it's just a matter of good people getting together, working the solutions out, and protecting Arizona's water from those who would like to have some of it.
From a federal perspective, though, Arizona's done a much better job than California, let's say, and we've done it out of necessity of protecting the water that we have and doing the things that have happened to just squeeze every drop we can. California hasn't necessarily done that. Is there a place for the federal government to intervene where California will become more efficient and therefore the Central Arizona Project and some of the other things is not going to be as strained?
Be careful what you ask for there.
Right.
You're suggesting the federal government come in and make things better?
No, I'm asking the question. I agree with you on that.
It's, California has made some poor decisions based, I think, on ideological requirements rather than real-life requirements. Arizona, on the other hand, has generally anticipated problems. We've stayed ahead of the game, and we've had smart, very public-minded people, both political parties, working on the problems. So we've been pretty successful, as you say, in staying ahead of the problem and squeezing everything out that we could. In that sense, California has a little more growth. If they would stop bad policy, they could get more water out of what they have, because they do. I mean, they've got a lot of snow and rain over there. We don't.
Right.
And yet we seem to do better. So it's about leadership. It's about making good decisions and this is important, being willing to understand that in a climate like ours, we're all going to have to make some concessions.
I know I'm going completely out of order, but what motivated you into the political world? Was it your father being a representative? Because you were a lawyer, established, successful. What motivated you into this public arena?
Well, I don't know. You're right. My father was elected to the Congress in 1959 to represent a district in Iowa, which is where I was from. And I'm sure that a lot of my understanding about things came from my father, who is a very smart guy, and a little bit of the Potomac fever, they call it. The interest in national affairs and government came from going back to Washington with my folks every now and then. And I naturally, since I wasn't smart enough to be a math student, you gravitate to the humanities.
Okay.
And part of that was government and communication and other courses I took at the University of Arizona, which just continued to stimulate my interest. And once you're a student of government and you think this is really interesting, you kind of get sucked into it, and it is really interesting. And there's some profound things that happened to us that it controls our lives. It's America's destiny. If you look back, why did we become the country we became? A lot of it has to do with pure politics. And pure politics has both its good side and bad side, I would say. I'm not saying it's the most wonderful profession to be associated with these days, but a lot of very smart people who cared a lot about our country and about the state of Arizona have given a lot to run for office and to serve and to make tough decisions that for the benefit of all of the people. And I guess that's what motivated me.
But you went into the House of Representatives 1987. You were elected, correct? That was your first year.
Elected in 86. First year was 87.
So you were there for the last couple of years of the Reagan years, what they call the Reagan Revolution.
Right.
What was that like? It was the Cold War years, the end of the Cold War, and then it was this prosperous time after the Carter administration. What was that like?
Well, all of that was very interesting. But go back in time about 6 years before the time I entered, I can remember walking up the steps of one of the buildings in Washington with a couple other people who had been involved in the Reagan victory, and to be a little bit surprised but drawn into their conversation about the revolutionary aspect of his election and the opportunity they had to put friends who believed in the Reagan Revolution into government, the levers, being in control of the levers of power to make decisions for the entire country, and to do things which they had thought and I had thought would never be possible, to change some of what the policies that we had been critical of and that I think had drawn the country down into a place where we would not have been able to deal, for example, with our national security challenges if we'd kept going that way. Carter, though a veteran and I applaud and certainly was committed to this country, I think just didn't make good decisions. And especially when that involves national security, there are profound ramifications for making bad decisions. I think we have seen that in the Biden administration as well. I don't know whether it'll get a lot better under Trump, but I certainly hope it will.
Do you see parallels? Because there's a lot of people making parallels now. There was one news story talking about the economy and comparing what the next 4 years could be like the Reagan Revolution economically in this country, with Trump bringing in people from the business world, like you said, outsiders to pull have the levers of power. Are some of those parallels fair?
Some. But if you look at the things that Donald Trump says he believes, and you look at what made the Reagan administration and the Bush administration so unsuccessful, they're not necessarily the same. For example, Reagan would not have believed that it's a good idea to impose across-the-board tariffs. Yes, if you want to punish somebody like China for breaking all of the economic rules, slapping tariffs on their goods coming into the United States is one of the tools that you'd consider using. But the way that Donald Trump views tariffs as a good thing in and of themselves, I think would suggest that he and Reagan would approach things economically somewhat differently. And therefore, I can't say that his policies would have the same positive effect that Reagan's policies had.
I think it's fair to say that a lot of what we hear Trump say many times is rhetoric.
Yeah.
And Reagan was known as the great communicator, that he chose his words carefully and was so efficient with what he said actually being what he did. Do you think that a lot of that rhetoric about blanket tariffs in when it comes to actually doing it, that maybe that's not going to happen? Or do you think that's a belief he has and is probably going to go down that road?
Well, I think it is a belief that he has, and I think he will try to go down that road. And since Congress has ceded much of its power in certain areas, including in this area, to the executive, he will have authority to do those things on his own without necessarily gaining the support of Congress. I think he believes those things. As you say, he is pretty loose with his language. And I think, by the way, that he views that as one of his positive attributes, that he can bamboozle people that he's negotiating with or that he wants to hold down by getting them a little off guard, not quite knowing what he's going to do next. And he's bragged about this. I'm not saying anything new, but he says, in effect, if I act half crazy, they won't know what's going to happen. And I tell Putin if he does this, it's going to be curtains for him. He believes, and I suspect there's something to this, that Putin doesn't exactly know what Trump is going to do, and that way Putin is kind of working off his back foot all the time, having to consider that Trump just might do what he says he might do, which sometimes would be pretty tough on a guy like Putin.
I had a conversation with someone recently that talked about some of the successes, some of the things that he's shown that give people optimism. The USMCA, the renegotiation of NAFTA, they believe that this was a good thing for the country, that there is a side of him that when it comes to making a deal like that there is something that he gets done that maybe somebody else might not have even tried. Is there some truth in that?
Well, yes, but it is not necessarily the case that what he wants to do is good policy, too. I happen to believe that NAFTA was okay.
Okay.
Put that right on the board. So my first thing would not have been to try to renegotiate NAFTA. What they renegotiated looks a lot like original NAFTA.
Okay.
In other words, it didn't do that much to change things. So I think you can applaud Trump for taking on tough cases or the establishment, whatever you want to call it, and sometimes doing that, getting changes done that maybe other people couldn't get done because of his style. But you still have to examine whether or not the change was worth whatever controversy he created. Sometimes it is, and sometimes my own personal view is that it's not. I don't think he is a genius economically.
Okay.
For economic policy. He, in the last administration, had some good people at Treasury and some other good people in the economic sphere of things, where working with Congress, which had a lot of experience, for example, on tax policy, he was able to do some really good things, but not just he. For example, they talk about the Trump tax cuts of 2017. They weren't the Trump tax cuts. They were the congressional tax cuts that all of us had worked on for a decade, but didn't have the chance to pass because we were in the minority. Once we were in the majority and the president was part of that majority, excuse me, I said minority, I meant majority. Yeah. Once Republicans gained control of Congress and the presidency, then we were able to pass policies that were really good for this country. And he was a part of that. He didn't necessarily initiate them, as the narrative goes, but in the first administration, he went along with them. And by and large, those tax policies were very good for America. Now, we're coming up on a time when they expire next year. So the Congress has got to repass those things or change them or not do anything, in which case they expire. And if that were to happen, it would be very bad for our economy. So I'm really hoping that along with the Congress, President-elect Trump, can save almost all of the 2017 tax policies that we are enjoying now. A couple of areas to look at. The estate tax policy was a huge improvement over the Democrat position.
Yeah.
They basically want to tax you twice. First time when you're alive, second time when you're dead. Well, that doesn't leave a whole lot for your family or your small business or whatever it might be. And Trump was strongly supportive of the congressional effort to change the law so that we didn't take so much away from people and their businesses when they die. That was one area. Another was to reduce corporate rates. Now, since I'm no longer running for office, I can say what I really believe and what I think most politicians believe but are afraid to say, and that is you can't hurt American corporations just because they're big corporations and you want to be for the little guy. The little guys work for big corporations. And if we can't compete with Europe, for example, because our taxes on corporations are so much higher than European tax rates, then American businesses will suffer, and that means American workers will suffer, our economy will suffer. So we try to take care of businesses as well as the people who work for those businesses. And the 2017 tax cuts cut corporate rates back to a level that we were competitive with the European corporations. We were getting killed in Europe. And because of the tax policies that America had at the time, we had over $1 trillion in corporate profits overseas that they could not bring back to America, or the taxes would have consumed most of that money. Well, by bringing back $1 trillion that didn't all get taxed, we were able to put that money into our economy and think what it did. Well, you saw what it did during the Trump administration. We had very robust, healthy businesses. You want that. And so those are the kind of things that have got to be saved in repassing the 2017 tax cuts.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Do you look at what Arizona has done in the past decade with the way that they've rejuvenated the economy with reduction in regulation, flattening of the tax base? They didn't get it to zero in income tax, but they lowered the tax. I would say that is to the great benefit of Arizona in this explosion and diversification in business. Isn't that a model that the nation ought to be using if they reduce regulation, reduce taxes, as you said, on businesses? Wouldn't that be the next thing that really got this engine moving?
Yeah, bingo. That's the solution. And Doug Ducey, our former governor here, I credit for looking ahead and seeing what needs to be done, putting the coalition together in the State House and State Senate, and passing very sensible policies, which, like you say, has reduced Arizona taxes, has gotten rid of a lot of the regulatory overburden in the state, and it is no coincidence, therefore, that our economy has improved greatly. That has attracted other businesses to the state, and as a result, we're really on a good upswing here, and I just urge the governor and the state legislature not to undo a lot of that great work, which, like you say, is a lesson for other states if they want to be successful as well.
A couple of things I definitely want to talk to you about. One is you were so well respected on both sides of the aisle, but you were also recognized as one of the most conservative senators in the Senate, maintaining your conservative principles and not getting dragged into the partisan vitriol. More vitriolic now than I've ever seen it.
Right.
But that doesn't mean it didn't exist back then. How were you able to do that? How were you able to do both?
Well, you mentioned Ronald Reagan. He was and still remains my hero. So if you try to do things like he did to be successful, the first thing is you're not going to attack other people. You're going to recognize that they have some legitimate points as well as you do. And therefore, if you're going to get anything done, and by the way, if you're in the Senate and you want to get something done, the numbers were always very close when I was in the Senate, except in the very beginning. You've got to work with the other side. You can't. The nice thing about the Senate is, unlike the House of Representatives, where a majority of one can succeed at anything they want to do, the Speaker rules, makes all the rules, and the minority are like potted plants in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, the great thing about the traditions and the rules there is that you've got to work with other people to get anything done. And so when the numbers are close, if you're a Republican, and as was the case most of the time I was there, you're in the minority, how do you ever get anything done? By working with the Democrats, working together so that you can get legislation passed that's, from your perspective, at least 50% good, and from the Democrats' perspective, at least 50% good, so that they work together to get good policy. And if you do that and you're congenial, you don't attack people, and you're right, and Ronald Reagan was right about most things. I like to think that our policies were generally correct. You'd be amazed about what you can get done.
But don't we live in a different world now, where as the electorate is mandating to the elected, if you work with the other side, you look at what happened to Senator Sinema. Yeah. You and I had a conversation once, I'm sure you won't remember, but we had a conversation about the filibuster. Mm-hmm. And you talked to my audience about the filibuster and how important it was. It's ironic, but it lives with me that Senator Sinema leaves the United States Senate, but it's her stance on not ending the filibuster that's going to save the Democratic Party in the minority in the Senate now. Yeah. They sent her a clear message. You are not towing the party line. We will run you out of, they ran her out of the party, and she left office. Isn't that the world we live in now?
Yes, it is. And that's there are two sides to that. First of all, the people, you can say, are in control. They tell their political leaders what to do, and if they don't do it, then they run them out of town. Theoretically, that's a good thing. If, as the founders all believed, the people are well informed. And I would argue that sometimes the voters are, while they always have good gut instincts. And I see them making great decisions sometimes when I'm just praying, please don't let that become policy or whatever. Somehow or other they figure it out. I'm not always sure how. But I also see people in the media today flogging issues and almost threatening the constituency that if they don't do what these people on TV say, boy, will they pay at the polls or whatever. And I see people on my side of the aisle, Republicans, on TV threatening. And what do they have to threaten except that they have an audience that believes what they believe and they can therefore generate political support for their views? But they didn't get elected to anything, and yet they're threatening American citizens, voters, that if they don't do this or that, then their candidates are going to get run out of town. Well, my point is you can have the people need to speak, and they need to be in charge, but they also need to be well-informed.
Right.
Critical component of our republic. That's what our founders believed in. And sometimes the news that our constituents get is not always the most accurate or the most viable.
Yeah, and I watch that all the time. I watch differing opinions based on what somebody else says, as in instead of forming your own opinion. And that's always been a scary place for me, being where I am and knowing what my audience is. The fear for me always has been, am I going to pander, or am I going to make sure I've got an informed decision that I may be saying something that someone doesn't want to hear, but I can defend my position because it's a well thought out position.
Yeah, and that's exactly right, and I appreciate that. much just because of the way the conversation between you and me has tended during these few minutes, someone might come to the opinion that I am not a fan of Donald Trump. I've been fairly critical of some things. Comparing him with Reagan, it's easy to fall into that type of conversation. But I voted for Trump because I believe that the Republican Party today has a much better grasp on what needs to happen federally in terms of national policy than the Democrats. But I guess what this demonstrates is I hope that I have a critical eye toward everything that comes up here. People would file bills in the U.S. Senate. Did I want to be a co-sponsor? Well, I had to look at it. So I hired good staff, and they looked at it very carefully, and then they brought their recommendations to me, and I looked at it, and I co-signed some, and some I didn't. So you have to make those decisions based upon good knowledge. Sometimes you're following the advice of other people who you have learned to trust. So you do follow other people. Sometimes you have to make decisions on your own. Sometimes you have to go against what seems to be popular or maybe against your party positions. And other times you need to be part of the bulwark that supports them. But be yourself. I mean, I always tell my kids, to thine own self be true. You know? If you know something, if you believe something is right, then stick with it. And theoretically, regardless of the consequences. Now, we don't all act that way, and we can't.
Right.
And if you're in politics, you've really got to be tuned into what your constituents believe, even if it's something you think is incorrect. But I always viewed my role as a senator as half of it to be an educator. My profession was 24/7 reading these bills, understanding them, understanding how the Senate was going to vote or not going to vote on something. And the average person, making a living here in Arizona didn't have time to follow all of that stuff. They kind of have to take little snippets of it from the news and maybe from somebody they trust. If they trust me, fine. But if you know something about the matter, then educate people. We talked starting about water. Water policy can be very complicated. And I viewed my role as helping to educate people to what the law was, where we needed to go in the future from my perspective. And then I had a lot of town hall meetings. So what do you all think?
Yeah.
Asking questions. I try to answer the questions. But I think if leaders could be better at sharing what they really believe the lay of the land is, rather than sticking their finger,
right.
What do these people believe? I want them to like me, therefore I'll just repeat what they say. You've got to have the confidence in your own views to say what you think.
But I think the danger now, I love social media, by the way. I think it's a great tool, but everything's kind of a dichotomy. And the dichotomy here is there are many people I think that are elected to office that will do exactly what you're saying, that they will lay out their case for why they're in favor or against something. But all it takes is someone in my business, we're guilty of this as well. You take one little soundbite, and you can spread that everywhere. That isn't the full explanation, and you can make somebody look good or bad.
That's right.
With just that. So don't you think leaders like yourself are a little more leery of saying anything because it's going to be torn apart?
Absolutely. And I'm guilty of that myself. I don't think I ever advocated something I didn't believe in. But it's very easy to try to find common ground. Well, seeking to find common ground can lead to agreeing too quickly with somebody else because it's politically beneficial to you. Mm-hmm. Now you're pandering. So there's a fine line. In order to persuade people, you've got to get them, first of all, to listen to what you're saying. And then you have a chance at maybe persuading them, maybe not. But that art of persuasion can, in the political world, lead to pandering. And politicians are guilty of that because they want to get reelected.
Right.
Or elected in the first place. I guess my advice on this, and I'm free to do this now since I'm not running for anything, is don't just take what you hear on television as the gospel and say that therefore that's your position. Think it through a little bit. Be a little critical and analyze yourself. And if you come to a different conclusion, don't be afraid to say so. And I will say that sometimes the issue is big enough that you're willing to put your career on the line. Now, a lot of times the issues aren't that big a deal, and therefore you can be with your party and everything's okay. But if you've got a significant, I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about here. I became, to the extent that one can be, an expert in national security, national defense matters. And that's the life of our country. So everything was at stake. And I didn't have any hesitancy in sharing the knowledge that I had and my beliefs on that, even when people in my own party disagreed, for example, because I felt it was my duty to help educate them if I had superior knowledge about the issue. That's an area in which I think our party is falling into a trap right now. And that area is what I would call a tendency toward isolationism, to keep America out of foreign wars, to say that we don't have any business as a leader abroad, that America should pull back to our shores and only focus on what we're doing here at home. Why are we giving all that money to Israel or whatever when we have needs at home? Well, as America, we've always had some basic principles. Try to stay out of foreign conflicts if they're none of our business. But if we have an interest in something abroad, don't just throw that away because you want to spend money on something here at home. A lot of the times, the things that we spend money abroad are very helpful to America, even apart from the larger issues of national security. But don't be afraid, for example, to support another country, like Israel, for example, if that will preserve fundamental values that America has always held closely. Don't let bad guys like Putin kick the little guys around just because he's tougher than they are. I believe that supporting the effort in Ukraine is a good policy for America. Well, that sounds more like Harris than Trump. Yes, it does. And I think the reason is that Trump needs to be careful about how he views these things. It's not just only look at America to make America great. America can become great by paying attention to what happens abroad. For example, if you want to export things, you have to, if you're trying to sell something to somebody else abroad, to Great Britain or Germany or Israel or whatever, you're the seller, they're the buyer, you've got to convince them to buy your product. You can't just say, you guys are all wrong, you're jerks, I'm going to impose tariffs on you, and I'm not going to help you if you get in trouble with a bad guy like Putin, but by the way, I've got a bunch of corn to sell you and I want you to buy it. You know, if you're trying to be part of the world and you need other people in the world, and we do, then you've got to look at all of the issues with all of the countries. Are there areas where we can and should help? Are there places we ought to stay out of? Are there people we need to come help? It's a complicated world, and you have to weigh all of those things if you're going to be a world leader. Well,
and a big part of those decisions go back 15 or 20 years, and you would know obviously a lot more about this. What happened with Bashar Assad in Syria, and what happened to the Syrian people? What was the U.S. involvement going to be there? Because we know the Russians and their involvement there, and so it really is a worldwide game of chess, isn't it?
That's right. And sometimes you have to make investments. You don't want to overinvest, but you need to make investments in helping some people abroad if their health as a nation can impact your health. Mm-hmm. Syria is a good case. It had a poor leader. He didn't do much good for his people, but there were assets in Syria that were important. And during the Democratic administrations following Reagan, policies were made for the United States to back away. And as a result, Russia gained a foothold in that part of the world. They have assets now in terms of port facilities and ability to call on ports in that area that they didn't have before, to have access to military facilities like runways and so forth, radar assets, and other ability to conduct espionage. So with a presence in that part of the world now, in Syria, they have gained an influence that we used to pretty much have to ourselves, and we don't have anymore. We're holding on to a little teeny bit in the northwest part of Syria, but we need to hold on to that little bit to have at least some eyes and ears about what's going on in that part of the world.
One of the other things, one of the most interesting conversations, I was surprised by the answer, but it was a brilliant answer. We were in Tampa at the convention when Mitt Romney was being nominated, and it was the conversation about the Supreme Court. And you were on the Judiciary Committee and part of the confirmation of the Chief Justice. But I asked you because your name had been talked about as a nomination to the Supreme Court, and I asked you about that. Do you remember the answer you gave me?
Well, it's probably the same way I'd look at it right now, so I don't necessarily remember exactly what I said, but first of all, it was not realistic, so it wasn't going to happen, so I could say whatever I wanted to say. I wasn't running for it, so I didn't need to
but I asked you, if they would come to you and say they wanted to nominate you, would you? And your answer to me was no.
Correct.
And then can you tell me why?
Well, I think the first thing I said was it's not realistic, so we're just talking hypotheticals here. I think I also said that I hope to make more influence on the things that I really believed in as a member of the U.S. Senate. As a member of the court, I would have to wait for cases to come to me and just resolve the issues in those cases. So I couldn't really be involved in policy. Now, I will tell you that there are people in the Senate today who view the Supreme Court as a place where policy needs to be made. And therefore, if the court rules in a way that they consider to be wrong, they're outraged at this. They're outraged at the justices, and they want to get them replaced or pack the court or whatever. That's not the job of the Supreme Court. John Roberts said it correctly. He said, I'm an umpire. I call the balls and strikes. I don't try to skew the game one way or the other, even though I might like one team more than the other. So I don't know that was consistent with what I said.
It was consistent. Okay. What you said then was that you had spent so much time in your career making policy.
Yeah.
And I thought it was one of the most honest answers I've ever heard of having to take that policy hat off and then make a decision based on would be difficult.
It would have been impossible. And the people that were on the other side of policymaking from me who didn't view it that way, I think were being quite dishonest. Oh, no, I would never be swayed by my former lobbying for this or that or the other thing. You wouldn't? Did you not really believe what you were lobbying or what you were saying at the time? People may think that they have an ability to put all of their past in the past and now be a total neutral judge calling the balls and strikes. It's hard to do. It's almost impossible to do if you're honest.
But when you look at the criticisms or the compliments that go to the Supreme Court, you hear about the conservative justices, you hear about the liberal justices, the complaints about a Brett Kavanaugh, but they loved Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah.
Or vice versa.
Yeah.
Is there fairness in saying that there's a conservative court or a liberal court, or is it just gotten so out of hand where we're seeing more political leanings, or we're perceiving that we're seeing more political leanings now in decisions?
Both, but there's more emphasis on the latter. A conservative court is a court that generally approaches issues from an originalist point of view, if you're interpreting the U.S. Constitution. Now, Brett Kavanaugh, I think, will be and has been a good jurist because he has a point of view of how you approach judging. Let me take just to tell you a second to tell you what I mean. If there are two things that the Supreme Court does. It interprets the Constitution or it interprets statutes and the application of those statutes to whatever the issue is. So the first question you ask yourself, if you're a Supreme Court justice, is, what's the issue here? Kavanaugh understood that the first question is there a statutory issue here? is there a reason for us to interpret what this statute means, or whether its meaning has been applied incorrectly by a lower court? Try to avoid getting to the constitutional issues if you can. That is a judicial philosophy. Most judges over the years have agreed with that. If you can interpret a statute, do that and decide the case that way rather than tackling an interpretation of the Constitution. You're playing with fire there. Sometimes you have to do that. When you do, then what's the best way to do it? Well, what did the founders mean when they wrote it? And the originalist point of view is deemed a conservative point of view, because the other point of view is that we have a living Constitution, meaning we can interpret it by what we think is best today, irrespective of what the founders meant, and literally irrespective of what past Supreme Courts have said about the issue. But if we think policy needs to be changed, we're not worrying about our role here, even though that's Congress's role to make policy and let the judges judge cases. We want to change the policy. So we have a living Constitution. We'll just bend it to today's needs. That's dangerous, in my view. But that's the conservative point of view in the court, and it does have a 6-3 majority in the court today. The other reason you could call a court conservative is who was the president who put you on the bench.
Right.
But that's not always true. The more recent nominations to the court by Democrats have generally resulted in more of a Democratic point of view behind their decisions, and just the opposite for those appointed by Republicans. But if you go back to George Herbert Walker Bush, he appointed a guy to the Supreme Court who was no conservative. He didn't realize it at the time, but people who were advising him thought that Justice Souter would be a really good member of the bench. Well, it turned out that while he judged cases the way he thought they should come out, he did not apply a conservative judging approach to it. So you can call members of the court conservative or liberal based upon really three factors. One, who is the president that appointed you? Not a very good way to judge. Are you more of an originalist, or do you believe in a living Constitution? That's a true way of judging a Supreme Court member. And then there's the final one. Are you looking at the Democrat or the Republican point of view? Well, no justice should be doing that, but I will tell you that sometimes they do.
When you look at, it was the Chief Justice, wasn't it? It's not a direct quote, but he made a decision on the Obamacare issue that was opposite of what conservatives wanted. And he basically said, if you don't want bad laws, don't elect bad lawmakers. Is that the point of view that you're talking about when you say it's somebody that's looking at something and saying, I'm calling balls and strikes. I'm not trying to skew it one way or the other. Is that an accurate portrayal of what he said?
Well, I'm going to go off on a lawyers like to go off on.
I'm all right with that. That's why we're here.
Tangents. The Chief Justice, I believe, has an additional responsibility, one that the other 8 justices do not have. And it's a responsibility to leave the court at least the same or better institution than when you got there as Chief Justice, in the context of the American separation of powers. The Congress is supposed to legislate policy, the executive is supposed to carry it out, and the judiciary is supposed to interpret the law in the context of real life disagreements or cases.
Right.
But the Supreme Court Chief Justice always has to be mindful of the role of the court in those 3 parts of government, and to try to protect the court as not an equal, but at least part of our government that you can't take for granted, you better not mess around with, because it can make big decisions, and to have the confidence of the American people over time that what it has done is good for our country, mostly because it is correct. It's made the right call. The other justices should keep that in mind too, but they don't have the basic responsibility because the Chief Justice has some powers who, he gets to decide who writes the opinion for the court, things like that. And I think in the case that you talk about, lawyers will argue this and law professors forever. What did he base his decision on in that case? Was it trying to just interpret the law? Well, you could argue that. He tried to argue that. Was it based on political philosophy? No, not really. But I think you could argue that the way he decided the case, he was trying to give Congress credit for making most of the decisions, but to preserve an area for the court. But if you mess up, we will come in and say you're wrong if there's a basis for it. And to some people, that meant that he was putting his more conservative point of view aside in order to preserve a law which had just been passed by the Congress and therefore presumably reflected the will of the American people. You can question whether that was true or not, but he was trying to preserve the court's reputation with the American people so that there wouldn't be a big backlash against making a different kind of decision. And you can argue that wasn't really legally his lane. It's like a compromise.
Right.
Well, sometimes in the federal government, and I have found this to be true, you have to compromise. You can't always get your way. And at the end of the day, people would say, well, then, do you agree with everything that went? No, I don't. But I thought it was the best result under the circumstances.
Right.
I think that's what John Roberts did in that case.
Okay.
To say, we could go a lot of different ways here, but I think probably for the good of the court as an institution, to preserve as much of the Congress's policy as possible, I can forgive the decision that they made here, even though they kind of made a sloppy decision, and therefore uphold the bulk of the law.
If you had a voice in this, do you think there should be term limits in the Supreme Court, or do you think the lifetime appointment is the way it was meant to be and it should stay that way? In
my younger years, I toyed with the idea of term limits when I was in the House of Representatives, and we were in the minority, and we were always going to be in the minority unless some things changed. Yeah, you can, difficult times generates radical solutions.
Right.
And I would consider term limits, if not radical, at least certainly not something that, in the context of the Supreme Court, that the founders were toying with at all. They believed a lifetime tenure allowed judges to rule the way they thought the law required rather than what was popular with the people. That was a legitimate point of view, and I still think it is. Term limits raise some questions, one of which is, what do you do after the term? What does a Supreme Court justice do? Do you say, okay, I had my time in government, making tough decisions. I'm not going to, I think it would be bad form to join a big law firm and become a lobbyist.
Right.
But the law would not say you can't join a law firm and become a lobbyist. So I think all in all, the founders got it right not to have term limits. Most Supreme Court justices who have reached the age that they should retire have either died or retired. Mm-hmm. So I don't think you can make a good argument that Supreme Court justices who've no longer got the mental acuity to be a good judge have hung around too long. I can't think of any who you would make that case about. So that's not an argument. The argument is in order that every president can appoint some people to the Supreme Court. Is that a legitimate argument? I guess I can make a case for it, but not a compelling case. Mm-hmm. Why should every president necessarily get to appoint 3 people to the Supreme Court. Whoever said that?
Yeah.
Why is it necessarily good policy? If you believe that the Supreme Court justices are just umpires calling the balls and strikes, and they are not policymakers, there's no case for it. But if you believe that Supreme Court justices are also policymakers and that they should make policy just like Congress does and the president does, well, then you can make a case for it. I don't find that compelling.
No, it's a scary thought that would be the case, that you would be an extension of a presidency. That would completely blur the separation of powers line,
Correct.
Wouldn't it?
Correct. And by the line, you're talking about what their job is. Congress makes the policy reflecting the will of the people. The president carries that out, elected by all of the people. And the Supreme Court is sitting over here. It has one job. In the case against Jones versus Smith, how do we decide that? That's it. You're not there to make policy. Now, I have a good friend in the Senate who's still there, a very smart person, who believes exactly the opposite. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court's job is to clean up the bad policy mistakes of Congress, or to strike out and make new policy. There are people in the Senate and in the Congress, in the House, who believes that the Supreme Court should be more of a policymaker than any other judge is. A Superior Court judge in Maricopa County is not there to decide what the law ought to be. That judge is there to decide in Smith versus Jones who wins based upon what the statute says,
right? Not
what he wishes it said or she wishes it said. And if you go before, if heaven forbid you are drawn into litigation, you want the judge to just apply the case. At least I would hope you'd want the case to rest on what the law says rather than on that judge's politics.
Yeah. And I think that's a fair question. So I got one last big, and then I want to get to something completely different. But I've maintained that in my lifetime, we've watched the federal government grow. We should be 50 states that has a federal government and not the other way around. And I think we have crossed that tipping point. We should be much more concerned of who our governor is and who is elected to our state legislature than who we elect to Congress and to the presidency. Theoretically. But I don't think we've done that. Is there any chance that we turn that around?
No, and for a very bad reason. That's the way it was in the beginning.
Right.
I mean, right after the Constitution was in 1890, let's say, 3 years after the Constitution was, and during the first term of George Washington, it was all about the locale, the state. The federal government was nothing at that point. I mean, they had little teeny offices. The members of the House of Representatives didn't even have offices, and they were no big deal at that time. Being a member of the U.S. Senate was not as important as having a lot of different offices in state government, because the founders never believed that the federal government would be that big of a deal. In certain areas set out in the Constitution, the federal government was to have power because the federal government before then, that tried to fight the Revolutionary War, but one can argue, didn't do much good. Certainly all of the leaders like George Washington would say that the Continental Congress was pretty worthless in supporting the military, for example. So the founders didn't have that much confidence that a federal legislative body would be worth much, and they mainly wanted the president not to be a monarch. So they didn't believe that the federal government was that big of a deal. Over time, however, people came to rely more on what the federal government could provide. And in many respects, at least by the 19th century, or by the 20th century, I mean, that meant money.
Right.
So the federal government can provide money. Look at the disaster relief. I have no opposition to the federal government being able to parachute into a place like North Carolina and help them with all of their needs. In fact, that's a good thing that the federal government can do better than the states can do. But I would argue that except in foreign affairs, there aren't that many things like that the federal government can do better than can be done at the state level. So the ability to ask the federal government for money or resources, or to pass laws to benefit you meaning any particular person or any particular business. What do you see in business these days? The federal government getting involved, picking winners and losers, saying, we're for this business and we don't like that business, so we're going to help. And this is what the Biden administration has done and what the Obama administration did, in my opinion. And I hope that Trump doesn't fall into that. It's tempting because you want to help your friends, but that's wrong.
Right.
However, people have found that the federal government can and does do that. State government does too, but the federal government has a lot more to help you out with in terms of policy or money. So people have come to rely on that. And under Obama, I mean, it was funny how some people in the country just basically came to believe that the federal government was their provider. You know, when I don't know whether this is ever true, but was there such a thing as Obama phones? You remember that?
Yeah, the free phones.
Yeah, the free phones. I guess there was. I don't know. But people talked about it. I want my Obama phone. Well, the federal government shouldn't be doing stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's the question of bureaucracy and how big things get. I want to end with a question. I need an education from you because I learned that you're such a big NASCAR fan. Yeah. I actually ran into you at the race here in Phoenix, and that was my first NASCAR race.
Yeah.
Now I am a self-proclaimed redneck kid from Florida. You would think that I would be a big fan, but where does this love for NASCAR? Where did it come from with you?
It's the greatest sport.
It is a great sport, but I don't understand.
I said the greatest.
Okay, well, I'm a rodeo fan. I would argue with you about that.
All right.
But what is it that attracted? What is it that made you such an uber fan?
When I was a little kid showing livestock at the county fair, when I wasn't taking care of my steer or my heifer, I was sitting up on the roof at Turn 1 in the racetrack, which was built for horse racing, half-mile dirt track.
Yeah.
But the best day of the fair was when the stock car race came to the fair, and they ran around a half-mile dirt track, and our ticket was that we were in the barns, so it was okay to go up to the roof and sit on top of the barn and get covered with dirt in Turn 1 when the race cars came around. That's exhilarating.
Yeah.
Now, some would say that's stupid, but I found it to be very exhilarating. And so when I had the opportunity to come to a real racetrack like Phoenix International Raceway, it was called at the time, and to work out there and be a part of it, boy, that was hog heaven, as they say, for me.
Yeah.
And so I really got into it. I got to know some of the drivers and owners and the leaders in the sport. In the case of NASCAR, one family has pretty much owned it since its beginning, and I got to know the France family. And so when you see how it works from the inside, and then you can go to the race on Sunday and see the results of that, in my opinion, you can't help but like it.
We went to, when I was growing up, I grew up in Southwest Florida. In Charlotte County was the county just north of where I grew up.
Yeah.
And they had a little 3/8 oval track. And we'd go out on the weekends, and that was the closest I'd ever come to a NASCAR race. Yeah. They would race everything from street stock to what they called limited late models.
Yeah.
And it was so much fun, but you were right next to the action.
Yeah.
And I had never been to a NASCAR race. So a couple of years ago when I was invited, I had never been in the pits. I had never watched those cars. And I was actually standing as close as you and I are to each other during the first pit stop and watching how they work.
Yeah.
You're right, it's exhilarating. When you're in the stands, when they get together after a yellow flag and they restart that race, you can feel it you can feel it in your chest.
Right. That's right.
But I don't know anything about the rules and the points, and I just figure first guy across the finish line wins. You do that enough times, you're the champion. Yeah. But the point system, what is it about that? Is that something you really enjoy, how that works now?
Well, I like the science of it too. And believe it or not, there is a huge amount of science in automobile racing.
Sure.
The way the cars are built, the things that they do to cars to make the car do certain things on the track. And just to give you an illustration, the guy that won the championship started very young. So he's in his early 30s, but he's a veteran. He's now got 3 national championships. Only 9 drivers in the history of NASCAR have 3 or more championships. He clearly knows what he's doing. The rules make the cars so similar that you have to be an extraordinary driver to win races in NASCAR, or to be extraordinarily lucky. And as some friends of mine once said, you got to be good to be lucky.
Right.
So you make your own luck. So after the race, somebody was talking about how Joey Logano was able to win. He didn't have the fastest car. He had a fast car, but he had to do some things on the track. One of the things was he knew where to drive on the track, outside, near the fence, or in the middle, or down on the apron. He knew where to put his car to disturb the air so that the guy that was trying to pass him, his teammate, by the way, could never get close enough to him to pass him because he had what they call dirty air. What's that? When one car goes through the air, it roils up the air. And if you're close enough to him, you don't have the kind of air that they build the cars to take advantage of. You don't have the kind of air that will push down on your car to keep it on the track when you're going around a turn. It's dirty air.
Right.
All right.
But also drafting, if you get close enough, you're taking advantage of that, correct?
You're not taking advantage of that. You're taking advantage of something different. And by the way, they have scientific places, models, where it's called an air tunnel. They put airplane models to see what happens to the wings when the air flows over the wings and over the rest of the aircraft. What happens? Does the airflow create the kind of vacuum that lifts the plane or not? Well, they do the same thing for these sophisticated race cars. And if you've got dirty air because somebody's been ahead of you and they've disturbed the air, your car will not perform as well. It won't perform the way it was built to perform because the air is all roiled up. So one of the things you have to do is you have to figure before the race, are you going to be out there leading all the time and have clean air and be able to take advantage of that? Or are you going to be back in the pack running with all the rest of the guys who are just constantly churning the air and making it difficult to race as a result? You've got to set your car up to be successful in that place too. So it's the guys that work on these cars and that monkey around with the springs and the shocks and the back end of the car and and the front end. All of this can be adjusted in such a way to take advantage of bad racing circumstances as well as good. If you got dirty air, my car runs good in dirty air. Why? Well, we set it up that way. Just one last illustration. You can tell I got a passion for how this thing works.
I love this.
But they'll come into the pits, and before the guy comes into the pits, they've got 4 tires. They will see how much air pressure is in each tire. Well, if they take a half of a pound of air pressure out of the right front tire, that will make the right front stick better to the track. So a quarter or a half a pound of air pressure in a tire that, when it's all done, is probably going to have 50 PSI. It starts out with under 20 because once they get hot, the air pressure expands, and so the car has much higher air pressure. But they figure all of this out, and there is a big degree of science to all of this. And I'm fascinated by that. I'm not very bright about it, but I understand a little bit of it, and it's fun. But then, and a guy will come into the pits and say, "Oh, my car is terrible. I don't have good entry into the turn. I don't have good exit from the turn. My top speed is too slow. Can you fix it?" Well, the crew chief has to do, okay, what can I do to the car to make it work better? And then he'll come in, "Oh, you got it just right, so don't change a thing next time he comes into the pits." Well, next time, it's halfway through the race. They put down a lot of rubber on the track. These tracks, the tires are built for an amount of rubber to slough off onto the track because the track has a certain roughness to it, a little like sandpaper. And so tires will lose tire on the surface of the tire to the track itself. Well, that has two effects. Number one, how does that rubber on the track help or hurt the cars? If it's hot, imagine, it makes it very slick. And it can get almost slick as ice out there. So you've got to have a way to set your car up to deal with a very slick surface. But if it's cool, clouds come over, it's no longer as hot, well, then you need to set it up a little differently, because you don't have to deal with the car slipping and sliding. You've got the grip. How can you take advantage of that grip and make speed? So all of these things are very interesting. Nobody much cares about it unless you're a NASCAR fan. But to me, it's fun.
For me, the fascinating part of learning that day was watching how hard they work to set up the entire car. It's not just under the hood,
right?
But also then I was able to, the people that invited us, they talked to one of the teams, and I got to stand right at the wall for the first pit stop. So I got to see them, and then they were explaining to me. The crew chief is telling them what they're going to do. It's not just changing 4 tires and filling it with gas, but they've got little changes and adjustments they're going to make, and getting in and out of there that fast.
Yeah.
That team, it's an incredible team. The driver get a lot of credit, and they should, but that team,
it's a sport.
Yeah.
And nowadays, in the old days, they just got the guys that worked on the car. Well, then they came out and worked on the pit stops. They were the ones that put the gas in and changed the tires. Nowadays, they recruit football players, guys who are big, strong, and fast.
Yeah.
To be part of the NASCAR pit crew. The guy that, I don't know how much those gas cans weigh, but it's over 100 pounds.
Yeah, they're big.
They're huge. And they get a big, one of these 6'8" linemen that's no longer in professional football anymore, but still has
still a big guy.
Strength, and the conditioning. Well, he's the gas man. He carries this 100+ pound can of gas, lifts it up, and sticks it in the hole there, and fills the car. And the guys that carry the tires, they weigh over 50 pounds, and they've got to run from the right front to the left front and slap that tire on there in a perfect way so that the guy with the equipment that
the air wrench,
with the air wrench that screws used to be lug nuts, but now it's
a
something
spindle.
different. A spindle, right? Anyway, that all has to happen in 9 seconds. Can you change the tires and gas up your car in 9 seconds?
Listen, I had a flat tire.
Even if there were 4
Senator,
mics.
I had a flat tire in my new truck. I called roadside assistance.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't even change my own tires anymore.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, it is a sport in that sense. A lot of the guys that work on the cars are geniuses in terms of their knowledge of electronics now, as well as just the mechanics, to be a good mechanic on the car. The guys that work in the pits to change, during a pit stop, to change the tires and put in gas, and sometimes make other adjustments on the car while they're doing that, are extremely athletic. The drivers themselves now, and this never used to be the case, are athletes in that they all have training regimens. They all have personal trainers, gyms, and they work on the things that condition the driver to do something that virtually nobody else can do. Drive a car for 500 miles at 150 miles an hour, average, let's say, under very difficult circumstances. And I will tell you, from just driving a little bit myself, by the time I was done, after 10 laps, nothing.
Right.
Just trying to go as fast as I could and keep the car straight, I was mentally drained. Keep that up for 3 hours. You've got to be a mentally strong athlete. Mm-hmm. So they all have their own personal regimens. That isn't the way it started.
Right.
They were just big fat guys that smoked cigars and put their elbow on the outside the car, and didn't even have seat belts at the time. Let alone the racing equipment like suits to protect them from fire, and that the way these cars are and tracks are built now. You can endure a very hard crash and walk away. But science has enabled them to build the fences or the wall so that it collapses the steel in the other parts of the wall. So the car, when it hits it, it doesn't have an immediate bounce back impact, but the wall absorbs the car, and the cars are built to do that too. So it is much safer nowadays. It isn't just, are they going to have a wreck and is somebody going to get hurt? Fortunately, that doesn't happen much anymore.
Well, the point of these podcasts, we've been doing them now since 2023, is just about stories about Arizona. And my first days in radio, you were so good to me. You and the late Senator McCain were so kind with your time for me. I think you are truly an Arizona statesman, and I'm so glad that you were willing to come down and share your story. I know you're busy, but I love telling these Arizona stories. I think for posterity, I think they need to be told, and yours is certainly one of them.
Well, thanks a lot, Mike. The thing I enjoyed most about my public service, in addition to helping to make good policy for the country, was helping to teach people about our government, why it's important for them to participate in it. If nothing else, vote. But there's so much more you can do. And if you really care about your future, you care about your kids and grandkids and so on, and you make a little time for participating in one of the political parties or in some other way where you can say at the end of your life, yeah, I did something. If you have a chance to go in the military, that's great. But not everybody is meant for that. You can work inside the process for the political parties or in other ways to say that you took your turn in the barrel and that our country is a better place for it.
And I think you've done that for the state of Arizona and for the country. So thank you.
Appreciate it much.
Thanks for watching. Catch up on Amazing Arizonans, a KTAR News podcast, and click the button in the middle to subscribe.